All right, folks, welcome back to Mike and Maurice's Mind Escape. We have episode number 125 today. We're going to be talking about psychedelics and metaphysics with Peter Sjöstedt, Hughes, or Peter Sjöstedt-H, I guess he's going by now. And Peter is an author. He is a philosopher. He's a professor. And he's got a great TED Talk out there. I'll put the link down below the video after we're done live, and you guys can go check that out. It's really worth it. So, but welcome, Peter. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks a lot for inviting me. I look forward to this talk because we have been in touch for a while, haven't we? And here we are at last during this global crisis.
Well, I mean, there's not a better time to philosophize than now, correct? I mean...
Yeah, you think so, except I've actually got less time to philosophize because I've got two young children at home with me almost constantly. So, I thought actually this lockdown we have in the UK would be, like my PhD, 3 years isolation, philosophy PhD. But actually, it's the opposite of isolation. I'm constantly with people, get the odd solitary walk, but it's, I don't get that much time to read or think, really. It's more like homeschooling, preparing food, etc., etc.
Yeah, maybe this nice, since you aren't doing as much of it, since you're obviously not at school teaching or whatever, maybe it'll be a nice little break, and when you come back to it, there'll be some new juices flowing. I mean, that's kind of how I approach those things.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I'm looking at the positive side of it. Yeah, I mean, exactly. One negative side is the big conference on the philosophy of psychedelics I'd been organizing for almost a year has been postponed now to April next year.
Yeah. So what's the name of that? I saw you promoting that.
Yeah, that was so it's called the Philosophy of Psychedelics, and the website philosophyofpsychedelics.com, and it's at the University of Exeter. It should now happen in mid-April 2021. It was supposed to happen last week, and it's we might expand it now, but originally it was like about 12 speakers, philosophers from around the world, who were going to talk about different aspects of how philosophy and psychedelics interrelate. And half of it was going to be short talks at 20 minutes each, and then the afternoons were going to be discussion groups. So a lot of focus on discussion, and then a panel on the last day. It's going to last for 3 days, it's sort of co-organized by Americans related to the Center for Process Studies in California. There's a Whitehead Institute, but yeah, it's been postponed. But luckily, virtually all the speakers are happy to do it next April, and in the meantime, we're going to get a book out. So those talks hopefully will turn into essays, which we'll publish in an anthology. So we've got a year to that, and at the same time, like I said, we might expand it, so we might bring in cameras so it can be live online, and might bring in more speakers possibly. We're in discussions now, but we've got another year. So
yeah, you should absolutely either broadcast it or record it if you can. I definitely think that people will be interested in watching that afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, definitely the talks, I'm pretty sure we will do that now, but the discussions, like if you're filming discussions, it sort of makes some people shy, so they don't contribute as much. So don't know if we'll do that, but we'll see. It's all up in the air at the moment.
So why don't you give us a little bit of your background? I don't want to go too much into it, but just give us a little brief overview of how you got into this, and how you got into it professionally and that kind of thing.
Okay, well, quickly, my father, who was an artist, a painter, he was always into philosophy, but more Eastern philosophy, so I wanted to study that. It wasn't really available in the UK at the time, so I studied Western philosophy. That's how I got into philosophy, I suppose, and then I was attracted to Nietzsche, as a lot of 20-year-old males often are, and then I sort of, but after that I read Schopenhauer, who got me interested in this notion that there's an underlying will. Well, that's Nietzsche as well, will to power. And that really brought me on via Bergson into a philosopher called Whitehead, who had this systematic version of panpsychism, which is the view that minds exist in all of matter or all of nature, not in chairs and tables as such, but in self-systematic entities. It's a very old, ancient, and respectable point of view, even though today it's seen as a bit bonkers. Got into that. that way, I suppose. And then with so I was interested in the philosophy of mind, how mind relates to matter generally. And I was teaching William James, and he wrote about religious experience or mystical experience, and he said, like alcohol's the first step of mystical experience, ether, nitrous oxide, and so on. And then it just so happens that where I live, or where my family lived at the time, there were a lot of magic mushrooms growing in local fields and so on. So I picked a few, checked that they weren't poisonous. I took them in London, and it sort of changed my whole. Immediately changed my values. I was suddenly very interested in the most amazing sort of aspects of mind, which before that I was completely ignorant of, really. And I looked at the literature, the philosophical literature. I didn't find that much. I found more since, and then I got really into sort of psychedelic philosophy of mind, I suppose you could say, in relation to metaphysics. That the cosmos is ultimately mental, and at the same time, I pursued this Nietzschean view. I suppose that's sort of epitomized in an essay I wrote in my book called Neo-nihilism, where I sort of argue that through Hume, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche, mostly, that there are no such things as objective morals, but nonetheless there's valuation. Yeah, and then what happened? Oh yeah, so I did a master's, and I taught in London for quite a few years, and then I returned to Cornwall, and I did a PhD at Exeter, which is in the adjoining county, Devon, and then I now teach there, and I'm a research fellow there. And this conference was the major part of that, which has now been postponed. Yeah. So I'm not really sure where I am at the moment.
Interesting. You mentioned William James. He was kind of an interesting guy too, because. What did he say? He said something about like the first lecture I heard on psychology was one that I gave or something like that. So he was very fascinated with the mind and everything like you mentioned. But interesting stuff. So where do you stand? Are you a nihilist currently, or was that just a phase, or what's going on?
I don't emphasize that anymore, and I call it neo-nihilism because it's not the same as general nihilism, like everything's meaningless. I believe quite the contrary. There's more values in the world than is commonly believed, But in one sense, I say, nihilism in the fact that I don't believe there is an objective morality like a Platonic standard that exists, to which you can talk about progress or retrogress, or ultimately good and evil. So I'm Nietzschean still in that sense, sort of. I think of the world beyond good and evil. Think of it as, in terms of conflict of values, but not necessarily in terms of good and evil. A bit like most people today don't really think of actions in terms of virtue and sin. Don't see the world that way because we don't believe in when I say we, the majority, at least here in Europe, don't see the world in that Christian manner.
Right.
And then Nietzsche basically just pushes that a step further and says even if you're an atheist and you say, you talk about good and evil or right and wrong or what you ought to do and what not to do, ultimately this is based on a Christian legacy, which we are now blind to. And his whole ultimate point of saying that famously God is dead is that if you really realize that, if you really believe that God, there's no sort of monotheistic God, then that has massive ramifications on the substantiation of one's morals, right? Or logically it does. So I think that's a reasonable point of view. It doesn't make you evil because there's no such thing, right? But it just sort of, I think it opens up your mind, and it also it's quite emancipating. It sort of gets rid of a lot of guilt or remorse that you might have had. You see the world in fresh eyes, everything. You accept everything ultimately, So at the same time, of course, you value certain things over others. You have ideals. So it's not black and white ultimately.
Yeah, I have a little bit of a different take on that actually. I think that we're talking about psychedelics. I think that might have been the catalyst for this morality in some ways. I mean, who hasn't taken a psychedelic and said, "Oh, when they come down, I got to get my life in order," even if you've got things going on. It's one of those things where it makes you reassess everything when you come down pretty much. And like, I guess not everybody's introspective, but that's always been my experience is this, idea that, it gives you this different perspective on your own life when you come down, and no matter what happened, you want to get your stuff together. But also you think that, like you mentioned, things that you've done are evil or out of, sorts, or something that you wouldn't have normally done, or you look back at a certain scenario, things like that. So do you think, forget about like the stoned ape and all that stuff, but do you think that possibly psychedelics could have been the catalyst for us to, like, maybe the self-awareness aspect of it, or introspection?
Yeah, there's a lot to be explored there, hasn't? There's a great writer called Octavio Paz, who was a Nobel Prize winner, and he wrote about this, not in a massive way, but he said that psychedelics destroy this kind of moral dogma that a lot of people have, because, as you say, it brings you out of your culture and you see things in a new light, and that, of course, can lead to revaluation of values, to use a Nietzschean term, can lead to a whole reassessment of one's tables of values. So you see things afresh, and in many ways, taking psychedelics, therefore, is a bit like reading Nietzsche. It just sort of frees you up suddenly. It's something like, oh, okay, I assumed this before. There's no reason to assume that. It takes you out of your culture, makes you transcultural, as it were. So that is, and not to say that is a objectively good thing, but it can, I think it certainly can help a lot of people, and it can stop the stagnation of culture. So from my subjective point of view, there's a lot of benefits to it.
Yeah, this idea
give you some fresh eyes, if you will.
Yeah, exactly, absolutely.
This idea of God, though, I think from interviewing a lot of people now on our podcast and just talking with people about it, I think most people don't believe that there's a bearded guy, a Zeus-looking character sitting up in the clouds. I think a lot of people think of God, from what I've, like I mentioned, talked to, is like some sort of maybe pure consciousness, maybe some sort of thread that, is ingrained within everything, that kind of a thing, some common, or primordial source of energy, something along those lines. I've very few people I talk to these days think of, again, the Zeus-looking character in the sky. What about from the philosophical standpoint? Is there still even people even debating whether there's some character like that, or is it all, like I mentioned, just all like a metaphysical nature type of thing?
In philosophy, not in certain realms of theology, probably, I imagine. But Nietzsche was very glad to hear about Spinoza, and Spinoza calls the universe God, or nature God. Mm-hmm. And that is something akin to what you just said. And ultimately, at this point, it becomes a linguistic issue, whether you believe in God or not is a matter of definition, so if you believe in him as Zeus or Odin or whatever, then it doesn't seem very rational to do so. But if you, like Spinoza, and I'm very sympathetic to Spinoza, if you wish to call nature God, then so be it. So, and therefore, that changes the whole dynamic of this sort of theist versus atheist debate. Mm-hmm. And Nietzsche himself criticizes people who call themselves atheists. They haven't got a right to this because they don't really understand, spiritual insights. We would call Nietzsche a very spiritual person. I don't like to use that word because of all its connotations, but he was very spiritually minded, as it were. Mm. He started with the god of intoxication, Dionysus, and he ended that way. He talks about mass inspiration, sort of a kind of, some kind of transcendental inspiration he got from his work and so on. So, I don't think it's particularly useful to speak about God in this, traditional way. And there's even question whether he was ever meant that way. But I think certainly there's reason to believe that originally he was seen as a king figure. You sort of bow down before God still, you pray to him like before a king, and he has his servants. Satan was originally, like his servant, tempting people to test their allegiance and so on. And of course this makes sense, doesn't it, from a sort of anthropological point of view. You see great kings and then you the ultimate king, and that would be a god. But then over time he sort of transfigured into the universe itself. Whether the universe itself is a consciousness, that's known as cosmopsychism in my field. I'm not sure about that. I think it's possible, but I haven't really come to that conclusion. But from a Spinozist point of view, I think that if you want to call nature God, then so be it. It's just a matter of linguistic preference.
For sure. Well, now I want to kind of get to consciousness and philosophy of the mind and mind and matter and that kind of a thing. So I've heard you talk about dualism a little bit. I mean, you even mentioned it in your TED Talk. One thing I find interesting is there's certain things that you can kind of pick apart within that. So, I mean, I was looking at, the identity of indiscernibles from Leibniz. So if two things are the same, that means that they have to be exactly the same and made up of the same components. And as far as we know, mind and matter are not made up of the same thing. How do you feel about that? Is that been kind of debunked at this point, or what's going on there?
I mean, this principle, also known as Leibniz's law, which is, like as you say, if something's qualitatively identical, it must be numerically identical. There's a lot of literature like questioning that. But if we assume it to be true, as to be honest, most philosophers probably still do, with regard to mind and matter, our understanding of mind and matter, as you then intimate, is each of them contain very distinct properties. Like for example, matter has a property of extension. In other words, it's three-dimensionality, space. Like an emotion, a mental state, like curiosity, doesn't. You can't define it that way. You can't say my curiosity was 3 by 4 by 7 inches or something like this. And therefore, by Leibniz's law, it seems that they cannot be numerically identical. They cannot be the same thing. However, there's another. Spinoza, coming back to him, he said ultimately mind and matter were the same thing, but we humans are incapable of seeing the core elements of both. So what we know of matter is just like a shell of what's real. Thus, panpsychism, like internally there's a consciousness or a mentality. And also what we know of ourselves, our self-consciousness, is also limited. We just get the shell of that. Now, therefore, if we say that matter is this absolute thing and mind is this absolute thing that we know, then they have to be separate. Yeah, absolutely. Then we get a dualism.
Right.
However, if from an epistemic point of view, if you accept that we don't really know what matter is, and that's actually, most physicists will accept that. We don't really know what energy is. Calculate it and so on, give it numbers, but we don't know if those numbers are all there is to it. And certainly with mind, like most people are probably not fully self-conscious. You don't really know yourself, or you get to know yourself in your dispositions at war, like a lot of people say, or in times of stress or whatever. But the fact of the matter is, I personally believe that we don't really know the full extent, the concrete nature of mind or matter. Now, if we did, it would be a parsimonious view to think that if we understood matter fully, we'd see mind in it, and if we understood mind fully, we'd see matter in it, thereby bringing them together into a monism. But I'll add this qualification, that monism is not materialism, not physicalism. Because physicalism is rather that, there's a physical then, that the mind is ultimately reducible to that. But Spinozism is that they're both equally fundamental, ultimately the same. But we humans do not have the cognitive capacity to cognize or to perceive or to comprehend in any way that unity.
Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense. But that brings me to bring up, Simone Laplace's famous billiard shot thing, where if you were given all the geometry, all the data, all the information, that you could predict where the billiard balls were going to end up off of a break shot, meaning that we don't have the tools to calculate everything within the universe, and if we did, we'd probably be able to see what was going on, obviously a lot better, almost like it would be like God's pool shot, not to bring up God again, but well,
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that is certainly that's analogous in that sense that yeah, we are limited on information. I mean, my beef with Laplace here is that it just makes too many assumptions. So, for example, it assumes that the laws of nature are constant. You know, if we knew all the laws of nature, and if we knew the positions, the locations of every particle, then we could calculate, and at every instant, then we can calculate what would happen in the future. I mean, you know, so many philosophical assumptions there. Number one, that there are constants of nature. Then Hume, for example, says we don't know that. We see regularities in nature, but for all we know, in the future, the speed of light might change, you know, or whatever it may be, right? So we can't generalize from the particular. Instant, the notion of a temporal instant doesn't make sense, and suffers what Whitehead calls fallacy of simple location. It's part of the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. In other words, an instant is a bit like a mathematical point. You know, it's an ideal thing that can't actually exist because every instant is really a duration, has a beginning and then an end, therefore the duration, right? And also particles. I mean, this is again an ideal. I mean, really, in reality, what we call a particle is interfused with its environment. I mean, ultimately with the whole universe. So this kind of determinism is based on these assumptions, which Whitehead, you know, tries to eradicate. Also, it's based on another massive assumption related to mind, which is that the ultimate sort of implication is that the mind emerges from matter. So if we knew the position of all particles in the brain, all the neurons and so on, we could predict what they would think. But of course, we don't. All we know is that mind and brain are correlated. We don't know the nature of that correlation. We don't know if it's an identity. As I said, we don't know if it's brain causes mind. We don't know if mind causes brain. We don't know if something common to both causes both of them. So that's a further assumption with that determinist nature of predicting the future.
Right.
And if the mind doesn't emerge from the brain, which also has evolutionary problems, then we can't determine the future, of course, because if the mind has any power at all, it will change the future. If it doesn't have any power at all, it wouldn't have evolved and maintained itself in presumably many, many species. So I'm not really convinced by this materialist determinism. I think it's just a product of a false way of understanding reality, sort of abstract way.
Yeah, I don't necessarily believe it either, but I mean, I entertain all possibilities and options. I do think, though, it's interesting to think about that maybe randomness is a subjective thing, and then we live in this objective world, so our idea of, you know, like you were just talking about determinism, that internally there is no determinism, externally there is determinism. Do you think that that's a possibility?
You mean so the physical world would be determinist?
So randomness only exists internally, meaning, again, back to what we were just talking about, not necessarily how, but just that we're deceiving ourselves because we just don't, you know, have, you know, it's kind of going back to the last point a little bit.
It could be the fact that, I mean, Leibniz wrote about that. For anything that appears random, you could find a mathematical formula to trace it, to follow it and predict it. And that's just, again, a cognitive impairment of the human race. I mean, if things were random, it still would not mean that, okay, it would mean they're not determined, but it would not necessarily mean that we had any determination of our own future and thus the future. And therefore, you'd still get into those evolutionary problems. I mean, I don't know the answer to this. All I know is any route you take, you come to a sort of cul-de-sac problem, right?
Sure.
So I'm not pretending to know anything, but I just see it's just like nothing makes sense. So everything just doesn't work out, unfortunately. I mean, there's a big problem with free will as well. How does that, how can your mind determine actions or certain actions, thus seemingly transcending the known laws of nature? Why would they break down at this point? Spinoza doesn't believe in free will, for example. You know, he believed in something akin to a block universe ultimately. So yeah, so there's a problem if you believe in free will, and thus no determinism. There's a problem if you don't believe in it either. So there's obviously there's some kind of reality, some kind of greater theory out there beyond physics and beyond psychology that would make sense of it.
Yeah, that's why. I mean, the thing that or the research and work that I've read in philosophy recently is a lot of Thomas Kuhn. Just that resonates with me because it's so true in the sense that we don't know a lot, and then 10 years from now, 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, it's going to be completely different because of this idea that the more data that piles up, bottlenecks, and then you get your paradigm shift, and then it leads to a scientific revolution. So I think we're possibly on the cusp of that with this psychedelic stuff and looking at the mind and consciousness and stuff. I don't know if it'll happen anytime soon, but the fact that we're even entertaining it, I think we're on our way to some sort of a breakthrough. But even then, it's like that's just leading to the next breakthrough. It's like we're Sisyphus pushing this ball up the mountain, and we just can't get to the top.
Yeah, I don't think there is a top. I mean, I think there's infinite knowledge that is theoretically attainable. So yeah, as you suggest, the more we know, the more we realize we don't know, and thus, knowledge advances. I think with paradigm shifts, it's a great book by Thomas Kuhn, Structure of Scientific Revolutions. That science doesn't progress in a linear manner. Rather, it's sort of there are little problems that a number of scientists face, and they overcome it. But then within that field, there's like a few anomalies that don't make sense. The classic one, of course, is with Newton and the perihelion of Mercury. It didn't make sense in the Newtonian physics. And then someone like Einstein comes along and says, actually, if you completely scrap that, rethink it in these terms, then you get that problem solved. But then, of course, that leads to other problems, like, famously, relativity does not cohere with quantum physics. And that's the sort of major scientific incoherence of today. They both work in their own separate fields, but they don't correlate. I mean, different theories about how they might correlate, like, that there are 11 dimensions and so on, or whatnot. But there's no agreement on that. And of course, those physical theories do not account for mind as well. I mean, Einstein was a Spinozist, so I presume he was a monist then. But there's very little agreement on these ultimate questions. Mm-hmm. I think one role of the philosophers is really just to bring out these issues, and stop any dogma. This is the worst thing. People think, science. The worst thing you can hear quite often is science says so and so. The fact of the matter, though, is that there are different scientists, and they vehemently disagree with each other quite often, right? Even with this coronavirus, for example, the experts disagree. It's not like science says this, therefore this should happen.
Right. One day it's one thing, the next day they're telling you the opposite thing, and back and forth. And
on the same day, different scientists will say completely opposed things. And of course, as a non-expert, what do you do? How do you relate to that?
Right. That's the problem. Like if you're not using your own intellect, who do you agree with? That's the whole problem. Is a lot of people are just following the sheep.
Yeah, and this relates to everything really. I mean, even like the Big Bang. I mean, a lot of physicists don't believe in the Big Bang theory anymore. But for almost 100 years, it was like that's the truth. The universe started 13.7 billion years ago. Now that run into a lot of problems, and there are different views about that. And
they find stars that are older than the dating that they have of the universe. So then they give the dating of the universe the about or the roughly symbol, and then say, oh well, the star could be younger and the universe could still be older, and that kind of stuff. And
Roger Penrose has got a theory that with the same data that we have, we could assume a different hypothesis, as in an infinite universe, as in infinite backwards in time. The whole notion of time doesn't make sense in physics at all, because the essence of time, according to McTaggart anyway, this great philosopher, the essence of time is the notion of past, present, and future. And in physics, that cannot be determined. It can only be determined by a consciousness going through it, right? Mm-hmm. So therefore, consciousness is essential to to time, to the notion of time. But it's lacking in physics, and this was like one of Bergson's main critiques of sort of Minkowski-Einstein theory of relativity, etc. So again, leading to the issue that we should be humble in our beliefs, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that at some point, obviously, science and philosophy have kind of strayed away from each other, and I think that science needs philosophy because that's kind of how we got to where we are, is making some giant leaps occasionally based on some predictions by philosophers that made sense. And if you look at science now, it almost seems like what science is this very dogmatic, slow crawl of chipping away to the next thing, or at least that's the way I perceive it. And I love science, don't get me wrong, but I do think that there is some blinders that they don't even recognize, and having to do with reality. And I think one of those, which I want to talk about a little bit more now, is psychedelics. So do you mind talking about some of your experiences, or what have your experiences been with?
Yeah. It's too late now to go back, so no problem.
Hey.
First thing, I'd just like to say about the relationship between philosophy and science quickly. Like basically, science, what we call science in English today, was natural philosophy in philosophy until sort of mid-1800s, where it sort of splintered off. And it took as its foundation a certain philosophy from Galileo and Descartes and so on, that there are primary qualities of like matter, solid matter, and then there are secondary qualities of mind, emotions and colors and whatever. And that set science, as we understand it, on a particular trajectory, which was very good during the Industrial Revolution, very good for making technology, machines and whatnot. But of course, it would always have to come to this cul-de-sac, which is the hard problem of consciousness. How do you relate mind and matter ultimately? And this is where we are now. This is an old, ancient problem, the hard problem of consciousness. And this mechanistic worldview could not explain it. But there's still belief, there's still the general belief, at least in my experience, is that we don't know how it relates yet, but the more neuroscience we do, the more we'll understand what it is. But this is, of course, what Karl Popper calls promissory materialism. It's like we don't understand it. We know it to be true, even though we don't understand it, and the future will bring results. Just like Newton, so we don't understand the perihelion of Mercury, but, further Newtonian.
That's what Brian Greene was saying on Joe Rogan when he was on there. He was saying with consciousness, he's like, I would bet everything that it's just a byproduct of material.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I saw that. I mean, that's just absolutely ridiculous. That is pure faith.
Yeah, that's a tough bet there, buddy.
I mean, it's absolute. It's a religion. I mean, it's like you have faith that this will be worked out because it's worked out other things. It's worked out how to travel quickly or something. Complete fallacy. Ultimately, my view is that this understanding the brain, you will maybe understand how to create medicines for certain mental cases and so on, because you don't need to know the correlation for that. Just like how general anesthetics work, we don't understand why they work. If we did, we'd know the perfect neural correlates of consciousness. But that doesn't matter. We can still use them for operations and whatever. But science as a method is fine in that way. But science as a dogma leads to stagnation of thought and culture. And this is one role of philosophers, I think, to compare the sciences, to sort of bring in physics to biology, which no scientists would do, because they've got very specialized roles now, to show how they're incoherent, for example. But
just to touch really quick, though, you mentioned anesthesia or anesthetics. There's been a lot of use of that as an analogy, or when talking about how to disable consciousness and then study it. I just read a recent study, and I don't know if it's true or not, but they were talking about how maybe it's not the best use to understand because you're still conscious on like a subconscious level when you're in that state. So you're not completely unconscious like they keep talking about when they describe these studies.
It's a very interesting point, and it's related to one that Evan Thompson made, bringing old Indian philosophy back into play, which is that, the general conception is during sleep that you are unconscious unless you're dreaming. And even when you're dreaming, you're not fully self-conscious unless you're lucid dreaming. But one can question that. He argues that there's a baseline of sentience even when you're not dreaming during sleep. It's just assumed that you're not conscious because you don't seem to fully remember it or recall it. But of course, you could have sentience without memory. It's quite It's quite possible. It's an assumption that we must remember everything that we go through. I mean, as you know yourselves, you've probably forgotten most of the details of your life. So it's quite a strong assumption. Same with anesthesia. And yeah, I haven't read that paper, but it sort of makes sense. Maybe there is this, maybe we're never completely gone, ever.
I like that.
Yeah, but I mean, again, it's another assumption. There could be things happening in psychedelics which you'd never remember. There could be the most amazing things that happen that just is not logged. Just like dreams. I mean, I'm now remembering more dreams than normal, I think, because I don't have to go to work and so on. You're in bed a bit longer, and I don't think I'm dreaming more. I just think that the recall is better, which implies that as is a common view, you forget all most dreams. But that's.
Or could it be that you're more relaxed because you don't have to get up and go to work and stuff like that? So that way, maybe your mind's opened up to. It's kind of a hybrid of what you just said, and less stuff to do.
Could be. How do you ever, interesting thing about that in relation to neurosciences, how do you even test for that? If you can't recall it, how could you test for it? Maybe you could somehow talking about how much time do you think has elapsed since you fell asleep or something like this. But there are things that cannot be determined purely quantitatively that are real.
So what's your experience with psychedelics, and what was the first kind of paradigm shifting experience that you had, and what do you still draw from that, or is that something that you've learned from in another way?
Well, I mean, the most basic, the first psychedelic I took were then magic mushrooms and liberty caps, psilocybin semilanciata, little ones, very potent. I mean, the first paradigm shift, as it were, inspiring experience that immediately made me realize the power of the mind. I just had no idea it was like that. It was nothing like a dream, nothing like imagination, way beyond hypnagogic hallucinations. It was just something else. Fusion of different types of experience, ultimate bliss, ultimate fear, and so on. So that's the first thing. We don't, when we talk about relationship between the mind and matter and self-consciousness and all the aspects of mind, intentionality, rhythm, iteration, whatever it may be, awakeness. This is just a minor part of what the mind can be. So we're trying to understand the mind based on sort of the smallest little fragment of it, really. So psychedelics immediately opens up different understandings. I think it immediately got rid of, if you've gone through this intense experience, some philosophies such as behaviorism, logical behaviorism, that mentality doesn't really exist, it's just smiling or movements, immediately out the window because you don't behave at all, yet you're having these incredible experiences. It also, puts pay to a lot of theories such as there must be intentionality in every mental act, things like this, that you always have the same species present. I'm using these philosophical terms now, but it says a lot about many assumptions in the philosophy of mind. So that was the first sort of reveal to me. This suddenly like a new mind opened up. The possibilities of understanding the mind completely opened up. And since then, I've been exploring how it can relate to different philosophies, different metaphysical systems, and so on. Like Bergson's, Schopenhauer's, Spinoza's now recently, Leibniz, and so on and so forth. Look to the drug use of other philosophers, like Nietzsche and William James himself. And
what was Nietzsche into?
Well, Nietzsche took, he was he took a lot of chloral hydrate. I mean, not classic psychedelics as we understand them today. A lot of opium. There's a letter where he confesses to taking a very large dose of opium. He wrote poems to opium even, and he allegedly from his sister, cocaine mixtures, nitrates. I mean, he was a devious soul because he was a doctor of philology. But as I think I mentioned in my TED talk, he went into a pharmacy saying he was a doctor and he could get any drug he wanted. So, and we know he did a lot from his friends, and also that's because he suffered these horrific migraines and periods of nausea. And there's an account of him, hallucinating flowers. There's also interesting relationships between his drug use and his inspiration from the drug of intoxication, Dionysus, as I mentioned. Mm-hmm. And even, his sister and mother. Now, his sister is a not well-respected figure because she married a very famous anti-Semite and started a blonde colony in South America, friend of Hitler's and so on. However, she and her mother, Nietzsche's mother, did say that Nietzsche went mad because of his drug use, because of drug abuse. That's generally not accepted because people believe that he died of syphilis from a sexual encounter with a prostitute, and that would be embarrassing for his family's legacy. So they made up this drug thing. But actually, when you look at the details, it's absolutely the case that he took a lot of drugs. And, very likely this affected his thought and mental state in many ways.
Yeah, so that aspect of is interesting to me, the non-traditional psychedelics that you mentioned in your TED Talk and that we were just discussing here. But what about more traditional ones? And I mean, we can go back, you mentioned your TED Talks, the Eleusinian mysteries. We have been doing an ancient Greece series, and part 5 is going to be on the Eleusinian mysteries. But Terence McKenna actually talks about a pretty interesting way. I don't know if you've seen that or listened to that clip. It's like a half-hour clip of him talking about like Alcibiades and being in trouble from taking in the Eleusinian mystery sacrament at a house party or something like that. I don't know, just the lesser mysteries, I don't think there's any psychedelics involved. The greater mysteries, I definitely think there's something going on there, obviously. So what's your take on that?
My personal view is that there was something going on. I mean, they take this potion in the greater mysteries, a potion called Kykeon, as you probably know, which ostensibly contained ergot, barley, and mint. But of course, Albert Hoffman, who discovered LSD, he claims that in the ergot, in the barley, it was likely infected by ergot, which is a fungal infection, which is the base of LSD. So, and there are other theories about what it might have been in there. But I mean, people fasted. They took a specific dose of a potion in a chamber of darkness. And then, the problem with the mysteries is it was, as you say, with that case, it was forbidden to talk about it and forbidden to do it outside of, the time and place.
Right.
Lest one suffer severe punishment. But there are accounts, like in Proclus. Plato even speaks about him wanting to be considered a mystic, and he talks about these visions in the Phaedrus and Phaedo as well on the soul. He talks about these experiences and being a mystic, and you get hints there. I mean, is it the Phaedo or the Phaedrus that starts on the river Lissos, which is where the lesser mysteries are held? Mm-hmm. So there's these kind of hints towards these visions being induced there. And also when you read like in Plato's visions, he talks about these ideal forms and the bright white light and so on. Now, what's the alternative? If it wasn't a psychoactive compound, they saw a drama play with actors on stage.
Yeah,
this
that's
is a lot of academics believe, traditional ones. I mean, I've got a lot of books about it, but
that's easily debunked, though, right? Because they were used to great theater. That's where theater came from. Why would they react that way to that?
And there's no accounts of actors being paid or anything like this, to my knowledge. I mean, it's not my field really, but it just seems unlikely. And also, we know that, wine in ancient Greece was very hallucinogenic. They had to water it down all the time. There were Dionysian festivals where people went frantic and so on. So this was not unheard of in ancient Greece at all. So it seems plausible to me that that is the case. However, can't be sure. Number one, I'm not a historian. Number two, by the very nature, by its very name, it's a mystery. We do not know. But one comes to the most... I think that the Kykeon contained something we'd call psychoactive today, which caused visions and changed people's lives. I mean, it was a major was a major event that all Greeks were allowed to go to, or all people were allowed to go to, including slaves, women, as long as you were not convicted of murder, I think, and as long as you could speak Greek, so you could understand the initiation procedures, I presume.
Even the later Romans came into the picture too and experienced them.
I mean, you got the Bacchanalia, which basically sort of the legacy of it. But of course, it was the Roman Emperor Theodosius the First who closed down the thing in 382, I think. But anyway, there are accounts as well, like from Proclus, the last Neoplatonist, which suggests that these rituals continued underground. They were persecuted by the Christians. But they still continued, and so it's plausible. It's certainly plausible, but you can't be sure.
Well, there's things that need to be worked out too with the ergot, because it's a precursor to LSD, but it's actually will mess you up in your intestines and things like that if it's not processed a certain way. So that needs to be worked out, I think, how that was done. But there's the book Road to Eleusis, and as you mentioned, but
Matthew has got a book about it as well. I mean, he thinks it's some kind of ayahuasca derivative.
That's because Paganum harmala, or it's pretty prevalent, I think, in that region. I don't know for sure that it grows in Greece, but if it grows in the Middle East in that region, I don't see why not. And you've got stuff like phalaris grass and acacia that are prevalent in those areas that have high, contents of DMT as well. But the interesting thing to me about the Eleusinian mysteries is the telesterion, like that's where everything was happening, what was going on in there. That's the thing that nobody knows. But these are things that I like to think about because it's very interesting. And I think that too, this idea of the mysteries, I think that this idea of being initiated into some sort of secret of life or mystery of life, I think is very appealing. It's very appealing to me. That's kind of why we started this podcast. So I think that's what drives us as human beings. I think that, while science is important, let's figure out the material world and how to navigate it and everything. This idea that there's something more is what propels us as human beings, in my opinion. What do you think about that in terms of the effect on the psyche and the idea of like teleology and that kind of stuff?
Well, Schopenhauer was a known atheist, which is unusual for his time, but he said there's a metaphysical need in each of us. Probably prevalent more in some than others. But I think there is an ultimate need to gain a greater understanding of one's life and one's reality. There is a kind of impulse. I think it's related to the impulse for knowledge as well. Sometimes there's sort of, you want to gain more knowledge even if it's not in your self-interest, it seems. So there seems to be these drives, and as you intimate, teloi, and now there were teloses, teloi, pushing us, of which we are unaware. Teleology, then, that final causes, that there are purposes that are actually intrinsic to life. I'm sympathetic to. I don't think that they are products of efficient causes, if you follow me. So, like Aristotle famously said, there are 4 explanatory factors of nature. So there's like material cause. He called them causes, but today explanatory factor would be better. So there's a material. If you want to explain something, you have to give the material cause, like pottery. You have to give the formal cause, in other words, the form, the shape. You have to give the efficient cause, what brought it into being, a potter. And then to fully explain it, you need to give final cause, like what its purpose is. To drink, in this case, to drink tea from, or coffee, tea. Mm-hmm. Whether those final causes are, in the case of the cup, the final cause was given by mankind, obviously, because it's a product of man. But I believe that there are final causes within nature that push things, that explains things. I think an impulse, like I say, can't be purely reduced to matter, because ultimately matter is an abstraction. In other words, it's a shell we don't fully understand. And I think that matter and mind are on an equal par, right? So an impulse, in other words, a drive to a certain objective goal, whatever that may be, like Nietzsche says it's power, the will to power. Schopenhauer says it's the will to life, to survive, really. Spinoza talks about conatus, will to maintain oneself and develop. Whatever that may be, I think that's absolutely fundamental to reality, as did Leibniz calls it dominant monad. I mean, all great philosophers and scientists really believe in this. Also, even scientists are spurred on. They have purposes. They, I think Whitehead says something like, made him laugh, that scientists have a strong purpose to get rid of the notion of purposes, thereby, forming contradiction. But yeah, no, I think that, well, as a panpsychist, you think that everything is mental, ultimately, and therefore a part of mentality is purpose, is telos. And that's irreducible to what we understand matter to be. You can't understand purpose in terms of matter. Matter doesn't point to the future, doesn't point to goals. It can correlate. You can get correlations. But that doesn't, like I said before, correlation doesn't explain anything. It just presents the problem. And therefore, then you realize the limitations of neuroscience in understanding the mind, right, or neuroscience as we understand it today, with that Galilean foundation, which is that it doesn't matter how much you know about the brain in terms of the matter that we understand today. It's irrelevant. You will never, ever understand how it's related to mind in that sense. And that's why metaphysics is so important.
Yeah, well, okay, so I think that I've applied, you look at teleology or purpose or whatever, and I apply it to things. So like I was looking at, let's apply this to evolution. Evolution, you listen to Richard Dawkins, it's a meaningless, nothing means anything. This is all a cosmic accident. It's just mechanism or whatever. I think that evolution has a purpose. I don't know what the end goal is. I don't know what's exactly going on, but if you look at what it is, why is this thing trying to survive? Why are organisms trying to survive if there's no meaning, if there's nothing? And by meaning, obviously, you could say that you could go through every single word and pick it apart because it's all just a construct of us. We've constructed language and basically this reality. So when I look at something like evolution and there's mechanism and function and it's all leading towards something, well, I would call that purpose. I don't know what the purpose is, but I mean, how do you feel about that?
I mean, I don't know if you've read Thomas Nagel's book, Cosmos and Mind and Cosmos, I think it's called. It came out.
I'll have to check it out.
You'd enjoy it, I think. I mean, it's the view that evolution is true. However, it's missing out fundamental factors. The most important, which is mind, then, in which purpose is found. Why is that? Well, like I said, you can't understand mind from pure matter. It's inexplicable in theory. It's disproof of materialism, ultimately. Also, like I said, if mind has no effect, if mental has no effect on the body or on the world around it, it would not have evolved. Right, so by Alexander's dictum, that to be is to have power to do something, we understand that mind must have evolved. I mean, if you ask most biologists, what's the purpose of mind, they'll be honest about it and say, oh, well, we perceive like colors, like to find fruit or whatever, right? Or we can see movements so we can avoid prey. They'll say that, but at the same time, that really implies mental causation, that the mind is having an effect on the body and the world around it.
Right.
But at the same time, that then is incoherent with the general materialistic point of view or physicalist point of view that you can explain everything not mentally but physically. So it's just a fundamentally incoherent point of view. Although with Darwin, of course, you've got, as well as natural selection, you've got sexual selection, which gives a role to the mind. One picks out one's mate. So there seems to be a huge role for mind in evolution, which currently is not understood, and it can't be because, like I say, the relationship between mind and matter is just not understood by science. So with that fundamental omission of knowledge at the basis of any theory of evolution, you realize that the theory has to be lacking in major respects. So my own personal view is we can only fully understand evolution. Well, I don't think we can fully understand it, but we can only advance our knowledge of evolution by advancing our metaphysical point of view of the relationship between mind and matter. Then I would imagine that we'll see mind playing a major role. Maybe this will be the science in the next 100, 200 years. Starting with epigenetics, we see the beginning of it. Epigenetics, which is that we're not fully determined by our genes, but also by the environment in which the genes find themselves, in the cell, and thus in the organ in the body, and thus in the surroundings. So, for example, if a woman is in a stressful, war-torn situation and becomes pregnant, there's likely an impact on the actual characteristics of child. This has been proved in certain insects and so on, by implication humans, but it's a young science. But nonetheless, there is a sign that there's mental causation, again, like stress on the body, for example, right? Mental stress. And interestingly, epigenetics was really founded by a guy called C.H. Waddington. And C.H. Waddington, in his autobiography, says that his sort of unorthodox experiments and hypotheses were based on Whitehead's philosophy, Whitehead's metaphysics, pan-experientialism, as it came to be known, or the philosophy of organism. And for 100 years, something like epigenetics was complete heresy in science. It was, neo-Darwinism was the dogma, and the dogma was therefore that it doesn't matter what one does in one's life, it will not affect the outcome of the children. It's purely genes that determine that. But, in the last sort of 15, 20 years, that has been disproved. And again, that is a very nice example of a paradigm shift. Sure. Someone's come in, Waddington in this case, primarily, not just him, of course, but primarily, and he's one of the main founders, and has taken a completely new point of view, in this case, Whitehead's pan-experiential metaphysics, and thus changed the science, and thus science has advanced. Of course, if you ask most biologists about this, they have no clue about it. They don't know about origins. I mean, I even edited a paper on stem cell science in relation to epigenetics. And the author, who's a specialist in this, didn't have a minor knowledge about that influence. But that's one example of how philosophy can help science as well. But then you say, well, that's not philosophy's role, just to help science. I mean, philosophy used to be known as the handmaiden of theology, and then in the 20th century it became the sort of handmaiden of science. But ultimately, with metaphysics, it can stand in its own right, I think.
So we touched on him a little bit in some prior episodes, but I wanted to get your thoughts on Rudolf Steiner and some of his teachings.
Well, to be honest, I don't know much about him. I know about his schools. I know that he worked for Nietzsche's sister, whom I mentioned, the Nietzsche Archive, and he wrote about it. I can't. One funny thing, all I can say is a funny anecdote from him that, which actually influences Nietzsche studies quite a lot, which is that he was tasked with teaching Elizabeth Foster Nietzsche, like Nietzsche's sister, philosophy, right? And he said she was completely clueless. She couldn't grasp basic things and didn't have a clue. And he ultimately gave up and left the whole archive, the whole job. And that's quite interesting because it's, again, a common belief that this book called The Will to Power by Nietzsche, it's a posthumous collection of notes, which was edited by Elizabeth, but also by other people. A lot of people think that's just made up. You can't get Nietzsche's real thoughts from that. She probably wrote them. Like reading Steiner on her, you realize, no, she could not have possibly written those notes.
Right.
The very notes that she would, is just completely implausible. So that book, as a Nachlass, as a collection of Nietzsche's thoughts, is very valuable. But with regard to Steiner himself, no, I'm afraid I haven't read his, except for that one and a few other little things many years ago. I don't really know much about him, I'm afraid.
He's interesting in the fact that he was hardcore or hard scientist and then kind of evolved into a serious mystic. So I think that that evolution is kind of an interesting one, that transformation, like what would make you go from being somewhat of a materialist to completely the other way. But so we've got some chatter on our live chat about the whole Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff microtubules and consciousness, and trying to prove consciousness through some material vehicle, and obviously they didn't succeed. I don't think it's a failure in the sense that anytime you can look at something like that, there's, whether it's something comes out of it positive or negative or whatever, you still have results. So do you think that there'll ever be a time where, because this is the thing that bothers me, is every week I see a new article, we figured out what consciousness is, or this is going to lead to the breakthrough that we've been waiting for with consciousness. And seriously, every week there's articles.
And it always starts like this. For thousands of years, philosophers have tried to work out consciousness, but now scientists have discovered what it is.
Right.
And what it is just like something that philosophers had considered hundreds of years ago and dismissed. Always. That's how the press works, though. It's clickbait, isn't it?
Right.
But it does get frustrating. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and I think that it does it at kind of a disservice, because it is like one of these true last remaining mysteries, and it's something that should propel us to look at it from a more philosophical or objective standpoint. But again, there's this idea from we got to prove this. They've got to prove everything. They've got to take the world over and say that this is what it is. And again, I love science, but I just feel like when you suck the mystery or the excitement out of something, what's left? We're just left with this, very...
I think science should be seen as a method. Like I said, you explore the natural world, extremely valuable. You develop medications, extremely valuable to us, but you also develop weapons, nuclear bombs and whatnot, right? So it goes both ways.
Right.
However, you must it's very important in my view to make the distinction between science as method and what can be known as scientism, which is science as dogma. This is the truth. And I think the reason that's developed is, especially in America, from my sort of European point of view, I'm half British, half Swedish, as I say, Americans like to be polarized quite often. You've got this big black and white, good and evil legacy somehow, I think. And with the religious contingent in your country who get very dogmatic, it sort of swings the other side, and then you say, no, this is completely wrong, it has to be explained this way, which then unfortunately causes this polarization, which stifles debate. The truth often is somewhere in the middle. With Hameroff and Penrose's theory of microtubules and consciousness, I haven't read the latest stuff they wrote. I was never really. I think David Chalmers was quite scathing about it as well. I don't see how it can, even if it is the case that particles go through the nanotubules at the point of decision, still leaves the mystery unanswered. But like I said, I haven't read the latest stuff, and what I did read was years ago. I think ultimately the problem is this, and the problem with all of this is our knowledge of matter. It's not our knowledge of mind so much. Galen Strawson talks about this. We don't understand what matter is. We call it matter energy, but just postpones the problem. We don't know what energy intrinsically is. We know what it can do. We can measure many aspects of it. Eddington, who sort of proved Einstein's views, he said that this is like calls it a problem of pointer readings. You get a bit of matter energy, it can point at certain, heat or mass or whatever it may be. But that just indicates what it can do to our instruments. It doesn't indicate what it ultimately is. It's a bit like the problem of other minds. I can see you virtually here, and I assume certain things about your mind, but I can't directly see your mind. This is the problem of other minds, and this is one of the major problems of logical positivism, prevalent philosophy in the early 20th century, which is that it's for proposition to be meaningful, it has to be verifiable in principle by observation. But of course, the problem is you can't verify other people's minds, but yet you don't want to deny that they exist unless you go, and that's why behaviorism really took precedent for a little while until it erupted in horrible paradoxes, and that's why no one really is a behaviorist today. But this is the fundamental problem that people don't realize, this notion of proof, right? If you can't prove it, it can't be true, or we can't know it. But proof applies not to all of reality. Like we can't, proof applies to mathematical equations. Like in mathematics, it applies to logic. It applies to certain empirical sciences, but even then, you can only really prove that something's wrong. You can't prove it's right, which is the problem of induction or falsificationism. But when it comes to the mind and metaphysics, when it comes to considering something you know to be real from your first-hand experience, but yet you cannot observe in others, not directly anyway, you can't get my perspective and my thoughts immediately. You can observe them. We have to realize that this notion of proving something, comes to a limit. We have to realize that there are things that are real that cannot be proved in this common way. And if you denied that, you would become like an ultimate solipsist. All you could prove is that your own mind existed. You could prove that other people's mind existed. And that would not be, in my view, a very rational point of view, right? It'd be irrational to think that you should only believe things that can be proved. Have to realize that most knowledge really is inference to the best explanation. This is as good as it gets, really. Inference to the best explanation. It's not about proof. Is a limited notion of knowledge, and this is what frustrates me sometimes when you talk about mind and metaphysics. They say, well, it can't be proved, therefore it's just speculation, but it's not. I mean, there are parsimonious views of the mind, and there are views that are less parsimonious. Parsimony, inference to the best explanation, so on. This is a whole epistemology about understanding metaphysics and philosophy of mind, which just goes unnoticed to most people, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I love, Socrates, or I guess Plato wrote it, but I know what I don't know. I mean, is there anything true ever said? I mean, if you boil it down to what do we actually really know, I mean, even Descartes, which I know you would probably disagree with, the cogito, based on what I've heard you talk about, but this idea that he was able to really kind of break it down. I don't think that when people think on those terms, they're able to really do that, really break it down to the most base core of what reality could be or is.
I mean, people get tricked by language. You have a word which refers to a concept, and then people believe the concept refers to something real. But of course, concept is always an abstraction, always limited part of what's real. The reality is something much more. We have a concept, for example, of the sun. Right? Does that mean you intimately know what the sun is? Of course not. You don't know. We don't know what's inside the sun, how long it will last, and so on. Make inferences, but that's it.
Right.
And so our language, of course, is the condition for our communication and condition for the amazing civilization that we have created. However, it's also our worst enemy in many ways. It just sort of, it's created a world for us which. Is very good practically in most cases, but in many cases, when it boils down to the fundamental core of reality, it leads us astray. This is something that Alan Watts, for example, is very good at explaining, in analogy.
Yeah, it's kind of a prison, right? Language is a prison because it gives you guidelines and almost like dimensions to what you can do and not do.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there are moral connotations to certain words like duty and whatever, but also just cuts up reality according to a preformed schema. You're brought up in that way, and that's how you see reality. And interestingly, like different languages then with different concepts, like a language which doesn't focus on nouns so much as English does, but verbs, for example, one would be more inclined to see the world in a different way accordingly. I think there's an interesting paper like years ago now, something like this, that even English and German, which are very similar languages really compared to Asian languages or whatever, they showed a picture of a man walking towards a car. They asked English people what's going on in the in the picture, and they asked a load of Germans what was going on. They found something like this. I can't remember the details, but it was like for English speaking people, they said what's going on, and they said like it's the man walking, and the Germans said there's a man trying to get to his car. So they have more, sort of somehow their language has more of an intention towards purposes than English has, But at the same time, English is an amazing language. It absorbs that which it doesn't have, and it's very flexible. It's got a huge lexicon, unlike Swedish, which I also speak, which is very limited in that sense. It doesn't have these horrible long German words. Doesn't have the sort of the sort of main word at the end of a huge sentence like German does. So it's got a lot of things going for it as well. But my ultimate point is that language, yes, certainly changes the way we see the world. Maybe literally. I mean, there are theories that, like, for example, certain Asian languages have the same word for blue and green. So does that mean they actually see the what we call two colors as a color or not? It's, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis goes into that. It's known in sociology. And this ultimately goes back to Whitehead's Bertrand Russell said of his teacher, Alfred North Whitehead, this is what he's the master at. Bringing out abstractions, telling us that what we have assumed to be a concrete, like real thing, is actually just our way of abstracting it, just our way of like generalizing about it, which misses so much, which is fundamental to reality itself. And that's why reading Whitehead in many ways is like taking psychedelic. It just, like Nietzsche as well, actually. Whitehead, Nietzsche, psilocybin, those have been three figures to me just to sort of completely change my mindset about reality.
Yeah, I just started getting into Whitehead. Actually, Joe Moore, we had on from Psychedelics today, mentioned him a few times, and I'm like, I got to check this guy out. So, I mean, is where I'm a little bit was more interested in the pre-Socratics and ancient Greeks and kind of working my way into the, medieval times or dark ages, if you will. But so I guess my thing with the language, though, is also that, like you mentioned, it kind of maybe affects consciousness a little bit depending on where you are and what you're doing. But do you think that that's why we, as Westerners, resonate with more of like the ancient Greek philosophy, as where, people are always like, well, what about, the ancient Egyptian or ancient Indian influence on ancient Greece and that kind of a thing? So do you think we resonate because our language is derived from that area, or do you think that has any kind of connection?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's a linguistic connection. There's also just the history that we we preserve these ancient Greek texts. I mean, it was actually the Muslims who preserved them in the medieval times for us. But nonetheless, preserved, translated, and became part of a legacy of a tradition. A teacher learns it and then teaches his students who then go on to teach it. Plus just the fact that, in the past there was not the travel possibilities that we have today, so it was hard to get hold of like an ancient Chinese text or something like that. So of course we have our own Western legacy deriving from the Greeks, but there's obviously very interesting legacies from the East as well and elsewhere that I'm part of this legacy. So I was brought up with the classic philosophers. Interestingly, Schopenhauer, people say, is the bridge between East and West, because he was very much influenced by the Upanishads. Kant wrote a little bit about them, but dismissively, or about Eastern texts generally. Lao Tzu, Kant mentions in a very dismissive way, he calls him like a Spinozist, as if that's a bad thing. And reading, like Evan Thompson and people like that, you realize that there's a rich philosophy with a lot of depth in the East. But even the Western canon, I haven't got enough time to understand all of these classic philosophers even, let alone the East. I got into the Kyoto School of Philosophy a year or two ago, which, briefly, and you just get tastes, and you realize that there's a lot of stuff to be taken from there. But what can one man do in his lifetime? It's just too much.
Right.
So I want to. We're winding down here, but I want to talk a little bit about my favorite piece of which is the allegory of Plato's cave, and somebody just mentioned it in the comments as well. We've mentioned it on the podcast a few times too. What do you think was going on there? Do you think that was just him trying to describe a paradigm shift, or do you think that was possibly related to maybe his experience at the Eleusinian mysteries or some sort of psychedelic experience, or what do you think was going on there?
I mean, it does sound ostensibly like Telesterian, doesn't it?
It does.
And seeing the light and so on. And that you can relate to like the passage in the Phaedrus where he talks about this procession of Zeus seeing these ultimate ideal forms and so on. I mean, that, it's very analogous. And like I say, he wasn't allowed to be explicit about it for fear of persecution. Like his teacher Socrates was persecuted for corrupting the youth about false gods, right? Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think there's a strong case for that. But again, you cannot be sure about it. But also, I mean, there's a rational case for it as well. It's a good analogy for believing in the forms, what we today call universals, that they're, for many logical reasons, which I first of all thought completely silly, but now I come to understand that they actually are not at all and quite rational. There has to be a kind of existential status for forms, right? Universals like colors, or numbers, or certain concepts, and so on. You can't reduce them down to particular instances. Mm-hmm. So with that sort of understanding, then you can see a good way to describe that, to teach that, is through this analogy of the cave. But not to say that wasn't influenced by his experiences in Eleusis, 14 miles away from Athens. I mean, I've had mushroom experiences where I've seen ultimate forms of beauty, like boom, 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 like this. Mm-hmm. I just thought to myself, or experienced to myself somehow, that this is the Platonic form. It can't get better than this. This is what all beauty ultimately aims for, this perfect form. And if Plato did have such, personal experiences, that would make sense of the analogy. Mm. But we can but speculate here. I mean, we're going back 2,500 years as well, so it's.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, a lot of this is speculation. Even if you go back and, it's like Democritus. Yeah, he created the idea of the atom, but then, oh, wait, it might have been his teacher, Leucippus. Oh, wait, Leucippus might not have even existed at all. So, I mean, there's all these different, when you look at that stuff, you kind of have to really just take it for what it is just the knowledge of it and for the times. But, well, I want to wrap.
Extract what is useful to you today. A lot of Heraclitus, for example, which I find, beautiful and somewhat useful. And for Heraclitus, it's more the process Whiteheadian philosopher of the past, really.
Heraclitus was am I thinking of Cratylus or Heraclitus? You step in the river only once? Yeah. I want to wrap it up here, but do you mind doing an extra 10 minutes with us, 15 minutes with us for our Patreon?
Gladly, yeah.
Okay. Well,
thank you.
Thank you for paying attention and watching us and checking us out, folks, and we appreciate it. We love you all. Stay safe out there. And is there anything you want to plug on the end of this one, that your books or?
Well, I've got a book, Noumenautics, which is on psychedelics and metaphysics and metaethics. I've got a new book coming out soon, which will include more stuff. But look out for my new book. It will be published with Psychedelic Press, an independent press here in the UK.
Is it a working title, or do you have a title yet? Or
I don't actually. I can't think of one.
Okay.
Welcome, dear.
I'll put a link to your book. I'll put a link to your Twitter account. I'll put a link also to your TED Talk down below the video after we're done, so people can check those out. His TED Talk's awesome. I've listened to and watched probably almost all the science and philosophy TED Talks, and his is probably one of the better ones, so absolutely check it out. And if you want to see us continue this conversation, go to our Patreon at patreon.com/Mike and Maurice. For $2 a month, you'll get exclusive content and access to some stuff that we don't publish on our other formats. So check that out. Again, we love you. Stay safe, and peace.